to order, please. All right, good morning. We will call our meeting to order at about 2 minutes after 10, according to these clock. Well, depends on which clock you look at. And I have straight up 10 o'clock, so we'll get started. I'm Rosemary Altman, Chairwoman of the Mississippi Board of Education, and we are present in the boardroom at Mississippi Department of Education. The meeting of the Board of Education is being held today, Thursday, June the 17th, 2021, at 10 o'clock via teleconference and video means pursuant to Mississippi Code Annotated Section 25415. Notice of this meeting was posted in accordance with state law and included the date, the time, the place, and the purpose of the meeting, and identified the location of the meeting available to the public. An audio recording is being made of this meeting, and minutes of this meeting will be recorded, and the meeting is also being live streamed. Dr. Carrie Wright is present here in the boardroom at the State Department of Education, and she will participate in this teleconference meeting. As I call the names, your names, well, we're all here, so there's no need for you to state your location. If you will just answer that you're here. One of our new board members, Dr. Wendy Barrett, had previous commitment, and she is out of town, so she isn't with us today. Dr. Angela Bass.
Present.
Mr. Glenn East.
Present.
Dr. Karen Elam.
Present.
Mr. Bill Jacobs.
Present.
Dr. Ronnie McGehee.
Present.
Mr. Matt Miller.
Here.
And Miss Amy Zhang. Is Amy on with us? Do we know? Oh, good. Okay. Good morning. A quorum of the board is present at the location stated for the purpose of conducting a meeting through teleconference and video means. The June 17th, 2021 board meeting was called to order at 10 a.m. Since this is a teleconference meeting, would you identify yourself? I don't know if that's completely necessary. They can see you on the screen when asking questions. Some of this is from when we were all virtual.
Exactly right.
So
that's right.
we need to work on our script a little. But make certain that you have silenced your cell phones, please. We are pleased today for his first full meeting to have Mr. Bill Jacobs with us. He is the latest addition to our board. He and Dr. Barrett and Mr. Matt Miller are our newest board members, which makes us have a complete board. So we're excited about that. Our pledge today will be done by Dr. Elam, and our invocation will be given by Dr. McGehee, and we'd ask that you join.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Bow our heads, please. Lord, we ask you blessings and guidance today as this body gathers to listen, hear, and thoughtfully consider the information presented before us to lead our state to higher heights and greater gains in education for the betterment of our people and our future. In the Lord's name we pray. Amen.
Dr. Barrett's on the screen.
Oh, okay. Okay. Dr. Barrett, good morning. She has joined us via video, and we're glad to have you with us. Would you state your location, please, for the record? Whoops. How about unmuting your?
Dr. Barrett, you're on mute.
How many times has it happened to people?
Okay.
All right, there you go.
Sorry.
That's okay. Would you state your location for us, please?
Biloxi, Mississippi.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Our first item for action is approval of the minutes of May 20th, board meeting, May 20th, 2021. Do we have a motion? You've been given the minutes. Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. We will now approve our agenda. You have the agenda in front of you. Are there any additions or deletions to the agenda? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion that we approve the agenda as presented.
So moved.
Okay. We have a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Items on the consent agenda that you would like to pull out for discussion. If you have any item on the consent agenda, I'll entertain a motion for that now. Hearing none, then, what? Okay, yeah. All right. So the agenda is approved as presented all the way through. Dr. Wright, we will have your report from the state superintendent.
All right, good morning and welcome to our new board members and those that are freshly new board members. We were talking about that earlier this morning. Happy to have you here. Several meetings over the past month. The Children's Health Council I serve on, we meet on a pretty much a monthly basis, and it's anybody that touches basically children. So it's the health department, mental health, et cetera, et cetera. And so we typically get together to make sure that whatever we're all working on, we all know what we're working on, and so we can really complement each other's work. Ms. Altman and I met the day before with the Lieutenant Governor to go over our plans for spending all of our federal dollars that relate to ESSER and relate to the COVID money. He was thinking about letting us know how he's spending his money and wanting to know how we were spending our money. And I did inform him that we don't really have authority over how the districts spend their money. They have to submit a plan to us. We are going to be sending them a template in the near future that drills down a little bit deeper around exactly how they're spending their money. Initially, their plans only had to have like big buckets, and so now we're asking them to drill down a little bit deeper to find out exactly how the funds are being expended. This last round of money, the monies must be obligated by May of 2022. And they have until September 30, 2024 to spend this last round of money. So hopefully everybody's working on that. The National Assessment Governing Board, as you know, has been working on the brand new reading framework by which the National Assessment of Education Progress is administered. There has been some concerns expressed about the document itself. So the chair of the National Assessment Governing Board, which happens to be Governor Barbour, assembled a subcommittee of the National Assessment Governing Board, of which I was asked to be on. And we've had probably at least 3 meetings to try to work on the reading framework and then give that back to the board to see any edits that we may have suggested, whether the board's going to vote on that, because we're expected to vote on the brand new framework in August. And so that's a significant thing to consider. I mean, the NAEP scores have come out based on the framework as it existed. So now the NAEP, when it's administered in 2022, will be based on the new framework. 2026 will be based on the new framework. So lots of important decisions to be made there. I was asked by the Tennessee Chamber of Commerce, along with the Tennessee State Chief and the Arkansas State Chief, to be on a webinar to talk about assessments and how assessments are being used in the state and about our summative assessment and data related to that. So that was really, that was a very, very informative a webinar for those that were listening, I must say. I also brought greetings to the Mississippi PTA, their 102nd convention, even though that was via video. That was the greetings that I brought there. And the Council for Grade Level Reading asked me to be on a panel to present and respond to what they're calling big bets about the things. What are the big bets that we feel are going to change education in the future? And there was several people that were on that panel. And last but not least, I was on a panel about women in public service, leading state agencies, and that was at the MUW this week. So it's been an interesting month and lots of interesting things happening around the nation. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, as Dr. Wright has already said, we met with Lieutenant Governor Hoseman earlier this week and had a good discussion about the money that districts are getting and that the state's getting, and the ways to spend that money. And he indicated that he was very supportive of several things that Dr. Wright presented, particularly our early childhood collaboratives and finding more money for children, for seats for children. And that's encouraging. His statement kept being that he was looking for things that would be generational. And so what more is generational, I'm not sure that's good English, but anyway, than beginning children, setting children out on a good start with early childhood development. So that was a good meeting. And then the other thing that we've done is that we've spent a good bit of time on. Dr. Bass chaired the committee along with Mr. East, and that is interviewing our applicants for our student representative. And then yesterday, we interviewed the 3 finalists, and a young lady named Micah Hill from Laurel School District was selected as the representative, rising junior representative, and she is just a bubbly, effervescent young lady who has a lot on the ball, and I think she's going to bring a really big enthusiasm and excitement and really a great working knowledge of her school and the needs of her school and of students to our board. So we look forward to working with her. She's really excited about it, as is the Laurel School District. We were talking earlier that they are really celebrating Micah's appointment. So I think we've selected a good representative and look forward to working with her. Amy, we don't see you. Is your video on? Okay, there you go. If you would give us your report, please.
Yes, ma'am. So today I'll just be talking about how my peers and I are spending our summer vacation so far, and how we've been taking advantage of our free time to participate in a lot of summer activities. So I personally have been working as a research assistant at MSU under the Department of Biological Sciences, and I've been interning as a policy analyst at the Institute for Youth and Policy, where I write articles about U.S. policies. And my first article will be published on the Institute's website in early next month. I have friends who are also doing research at Ole Miss through the programs of Rebel Research and Arise, and they are doing more of their own projects with their own ideas for their research, and I think that's really cool too. And yet other people are using this time to help others in their community. So for example, about a dozen MSMS students volunteer as camp counselors at the MSMS Summer Enrichment Program every week. I know a group of students have set up an online tutoring program for elementary schoolers, and people are organizing ACT and test prep meetings. And one of my classmates has set up a meeting in early July to help people take a practice ACT test for people who are taking the July ACT. And finally, a collective stress has kind of fallen on rising seniors, and we're worrying about college applications, essays, what we want to major in, what we want to do for the rest of our lives. And I admit that I don't have all of my answers right now, but I have a few months to decide. So that's a really big worry for us right now, but I'm sure we will make it through it. And lastly, I'd like to welcome Micah Hill to the Board of Education as the junior student representative, as well as congratulate Isabella Reynolds for being selected as the alternate. I'm really excited to see Micah transform her ideals on statewide education into a reality, as well as hear the unique perspective she'll bring to the table. And I'm really looking forward to serving with her for the next school year. So once again, I'd like to congratulate Micah.
Thank you, Amy. We look forward to seeing you at the July meeting, live and in person. And while you're doing all that work this summer, that's very impressive. I hope you'll find a few days, little time just to hang out and enjoy the summer. So thanks. We appreciate that. We appreciate what you're doing and look forward to hearing about your summer experiences. Do we have a report on the any subcommittees? What happened to Dr. Elam? Okay. Well, if when she comes back in, if she has a report, we'll stop and let her give it. Our next items are action items. The first one being approval of a temporary rule to begin the APA process to establish Mississippi Administrative Code 739.3. State Board Policy 9, Rule 9.3. That is a lot of carrying on. School-wide and district-wide virtual learning days. And let me just say for our new people, would we not talk in acronyms? So maybe we can all,
We were
Yes,
talking about
ma'am,
that
I'll
today.
do
for the
my-
time being.
It's asking a lot.
I'll do my very, very best to do that. Oh, you don't think I'm going to try to prove Dr. McGehee wrong. If I may, Madam Chair, I'll take these, Dr. Malone, and I'll take these items together and give you just a little bit of background.
Items 1 and 2, you're talking.
Yes, ma'am, items
Okay.
1 and 2.
Yeah.
It's 2 separate proposed policies that we would establish. We're asking you to approve a temporary rule, which would be effective immediately, but does not prevent us from having to complete the full APA or the Administrative Procedures Act process for public comment. So we would still be going through the same process, receiving public comment, bringing those comments back to the board in July for your consideration and or any amendments to those proposed policies.
Let me interrupt you just a minute so the people who are listening to us, the item 2 that you're going to be covering is State Board Policy 56, Rule 56.2, which relates to virtual students.
Yes, ma'am.
So,
And both of these policies are related to virtual learning. One is the use of district-wide and statewide virtual learning days, and that's the first item. And the second item is related to individual students.
Right.
But we, again, with the process of establishing these proposed items, were the same, so for the sake of time, we'll go through that, cover both items, and then we will provide an overview of both of the items separately. The MDE did establish a virtual learning steering committee in order to develop these proposed policies for virtual learning. The steering committee consisted of students, and I can tell you the number. We had 3 student representatives, one from East Jasper, one from Madison County, and one from Columbia. It consisted of 3 teachers. We had representation as teachers from Madison County, Jones County, and Cleveland. We had 3 principals, I'm sorry. Columbia, New Albany, and Petal school districts were represented, and we had 2 superintendents represented on the steering committee, Mr. Glenn East from Gulfport and Dr. Michelle Bivens from Pontotoc City. And so what we did, we gave, prior to the first meeting, we had Dr. Joanne Malone, and then we had Mr. Cody Shoemaker, who actually facilitated the meetings, and he did a great job preparing for those meetings. Mr. Shoemaker pulled together a pre-work assignment for each of the individual categories. So he gave the superintendents a pre-work assignment, he gave the principals, the teachers, and the students. And just as a quick overview, I'll give you an example of the superintendents, but then as we worked the way down to the students, each pre-work assignment was applicable to who they represented. But the pre-work assignment was related to 3 buckets of questions, like what does virtual learning look like? What does it look like synchronously and asynchronously? How do superintendents, for this example, hold principals and teacher accountable for high-quality instruction
related to virtual learning. We asked the superintendents if they had a policy in their district related to virtual learning. Was it based on choice of students to remain in virtual learning, or did their policy outline if a student happened to drop their grade to the level of failing that they did not have an option but had to return to in-person learning? We asked what form of data collection processes they had within the LEA to measure their virtual learning outcomes. The second bucket of questions was around what should virtual learning look like? So based on what you've learned about virtual learning in the past, what should it look like moving forward? And what should the distance or virtual learning opportunities look like? Should it be the same for all grade bands, such as K-12, 412, 712? Should it include all grade levels, or should it be limited to certain grade levels? We asked them to think about distance learning opportunities between LEAs. If there were to establish an MOU between districts, what would that look like? We asked questions around potential professional development trainings from the Department of Ed. So what do the LEAs need from us that we may or may not have provided, and how we could do a better job to prepare districts throughout the virtual learning process. And then the last bucket around when should virtual learning be offered? So when, how often, what specific circumstances should LEAs allow schools within their districts or the district to use that virtual learning option? And do they have any impact data from the 2021 school year, like such as their interim or their benchmark assessments? And what were the findings? What were the outcomes? Did they determine that there was one particular mode of learning that students performed better, such as in the traditional setting, or how did their students on a hybrid schedule do versus the virtual? We also, virtual learners that did not have any other combination. So we also asked them to engage in conversations with their peers. I mean, so students, teachers, so what does it look like in other districts, and what opportunities they may have had. So after submitting that, we all came together for the first meeting, and the agency gave or issued the charge, the overall charge for the development of the policy. And our charge was for the steering committee to create a statewide virtual learning policy post-COVID that ensured that virtual learning opportunities are equivalent to in-person learning, traditional learning, so that all students in Mississippi receive that same level of high-quality educational experience. We asked them to define what a virtual day would look like, to establish parameters for teaching and learning throughout those virtual learning days, and to look at some policy shift recommendations to consider what we have in state statute or in our state board policies versus what they have in their local school district policies, and that we needed to have some conversation around data collection and options and processes. And then, as I previously mentioned, what would MDE support and training opportunities for district and school personnel look like? So we also provided all of the non-negotiables that we had as an agency that should be included in these proposed policies, and we provided the rationale for those non-negotiables, all of which just happened to be in state statute. So we gave them the rationale as to why we had non-negotiables, and I won't take the time to walk through all of those, but some examples of that would be you have to have 180 days of instruction. The instructional day must consist of 330 minutes per day, in which both students and teachers are engaged in teaching and learning. And so there was a lot of conversation around, and you'll see that, well, you won't see that in the policy, but you'll see the policy allows for both synchronous and asynchronous. But there was a lot of conversation around when just 100% asynchronous learning would be an option. But when you go back to the statute and the charge that the statute gives us as the regulatory agency, we have to ensure that both teachers and students are engaged in learning. So we walked through each of those with the process standards such as student-teacher ratios, and gave all of the examples that are required through state statute. So again, I could go through all of those, but I think the board's very aware of what our requirements are. So at the first meeting, we asked questions based on those pre-work assignments. The steering committee was very engaged, very opinionated, not always in agreement with every proposal. But after that meeting, Dr. Malone and Mr. Shoemaker had the tremendous charge of trying to take all the notes that we had throughout those meetings, that particular meeting, and divide that into the two proposed policies and in the format of a policy. And at that time between meetings, that's what they did, was put the notes or the comments, the suggestions, all in a policy format for what we believed that the steering committee was proposing, and then we sent those policies back, proposed policies, drafts, back out to the steering committee prior to the next meeting so that they had an opportunity to review those proposals and then have something to react to when they met again. So, and then at the last meeting of the steering committee, that's when we took their feedback based on the drafts they had seen. And then after that, we brought the final product or the work of the steering committee back to agency staff across the academic team, accountability team, the technology team, everyone that within the agency that this policy would impact, as well as agency leadership, and allowed them to take a look at the policy. We had some minor changes to the proposals, and it was just really around language clarifications to ensure that the language that's in the proposed policy actually aligned to the language in federal law, such as FAPE, or the state law around actual teaching days, et cetera. So at this time, we'll take item 1 as the first one, right, for policy 9.3? Okay, so policy 9.3 would establish the parameters around school-wide or district-wide use of virtual learning days. So both policies begin, with a paragraph that states, with the 21-22 school year, all districts shall resume providing face-to-face instruction. And that just means that we would have no districts that would be allowed at the beginning of the school year to operate 100% virtually. And then the policy goes into the requirement for the 180 days, with no more than 2 of those 180 days being 60% days. The requirement that both teachers and pupils be in attendance. We also, in that policy, proposed policy, in the event of unplanned or unforeseen circumstances, districts may opt to utilize designated school-wide or district-wide virtual learning throughout the year when deemed necessary. And we didn't cite all the examples, but it could be anything from a water crisis to a gas leak or a tornado that damages schools in one particular school zone, where you could take that particular school or that zone, if it's a large district, and convert to virtual learning. But then, again, reminding districts in this policy that the 330 minutes still must take place, that there should be lesson plans, and the lesson plans should they may include both synchronous and asynchronous activities, but the lesson plans must outline what portion of that lesson would be designated to each of those modes of instruction. And then if off-campus instruction is provided, the policy requires that any student, maybe with an IEP or a 504 plan, that should have access to an additional teacher rather than the teacher of record on MSIS, that those teachers must be available for those students as well during that time. There is a section that says virtual learning days, district-wide or school-wide, shall not be used for professional development, for participation in extracurricular activities, if a school just wants to close and go virtual because their football team is in the playoffs that night, et cetera, or to provide additional, planning time. We also, this policy also outlines, just as the second will, that the virtual learning standards are held to the same level of in-person instruction. Staff are to be notified in advance that all students and staff must be familiar with any equipment, online platforms, any district-wide policies for student issues devices. And then the only option that the district would have for a student to be fully asynchronous would be those that do not have access to internet services, and that must be predetermined, and the district must be prepared to ensure how that instruction would be equivalent to the in-person instruction. And then it goes on to talk about the inclement weather days, because as you all know, there's a statute 371364 for weather that allows districts the authority, based on their local board policy, to make up or not make up to 10 days associated with weather. And if a district is able to predict, such as a hurricane that you might have days to prepare for, that you would convert to virtual learning, and then you make those plans, you convert to virtual learning, and then there's an unexpected outage of electricity throughout an entire district, and you're not able to follow through with that virtual learning, then the superintendent and the board will have to come back and make a decision, either one, to make up that day, because they cannot count it as a virtual day because there was no electricity, or use that as one of the days that the policy allows them to not make up. And then each of the policies represent, because there's a lot of policies that you have to consider in combination with one another, so each policy has these see also, see also, see also to reference in conjunction with that policy. So do we want to pause, because that is item 1?
Right, and that is going out for the APA.
Yes, ma'am.
And it will come back.
Yes,
once
ma'am.
you're-
But what we are asking is for the temporary rule with this item.
Right,
So that
yeah.
this would be effective immediately, and upon the board's vote today, local districts could begin developing their local policies that would meet these requirements, because we are approaching rapidly the start of the 21-22 school year, but we would come back in July with any modifications based on that APA comment.
Because we typically don't, just for new board members, don't ask for a temporary rule, but we've been getting a lot of questions from districts because they're preparing their calendars, they're preparing, new policies, and so we thought if we could get the temporary rule, that would at least get them started, and then we will still come back after all the comments to see if there's any edits or things that need to be made at the July meeting.
And that's a good point, Dr. Whiteman, because for clarity, a temporary rule does not mean that the board does not have the authority to make changes, or that,
Correct.
or staff to recommend changes to this proposed policy, because we need to wait until we receive all of the public comments in order to make those decisions and bring it back to the board to ask for final approval.
Yes, I do think we need to take one and clear up any questions they may have before we move to 2, although you're kind of covering both of them at one time. So on 1, questions or comments?
First, to my colleague, I thought there were 3 superintendents. There must be a high school principal that needs to be a superintendent on that group meeting. We were discussing this.
I agree.
And I may have misspoke, I better double check, but I think it was.
It is not on Zoom, so who knows?
I might better
So I'm gonna
check.
put this in layman's term, Paula, as we go through. So what we're doing is we're giving schools guidelines, and taking away the use of virtual for things that really are not student-related. You cannot just have a day for virtual where your kids go home and are working asynchronously and you're doing professional development, or working synchronously or asynchronously. They have to be in a face-to-face environment. school districts have the power to do a virtual program for students every day for an entire school year, but they must meet the 330 minutes requirements. They must have lesson plans that are beyond asynchronous work. There has to be a synchronous component and an asynchronous component, just like you would in your regular classroom. So what I mean by that is a teacher teaches in face-to-face, she begins a lesson or he begins a lesson, and then they may break off into small groups. So the same thing virtually could happen is the teacher introduces the lesson, she spends a part of that period with her students face-to-face, and they can break them into an asynchronous work or a small group that she may not have contact, but then brings them back in at the close of that class, whatever the case may be, to close out that lesson just like a face-to-face teacher would do, right?
Yes, sir.
And then what we're really trying to do is, at the end of the day, we've expanded this to help us out with natural disasters. The COVID comes in again, or whatever the case may be, or let's say a local school has an outbreak of the flu. And so that gives them some power there. But the key is we're going back to normal with a very virtual component to help school districts out, both full-time for a set group of students and part-time as needed.
That's
Now I'm saying this again, so I want to make sure we emphasize this, but in the full-time, you're following the same instructional guidelines that you have to follow for face-to-face basis. 330 minutes, lesson plans that show that, documentation of attendance.
And that's the same with the individual days. If it's a day here or a day there, that's the policy that we just reviewed, 9.3. So every virtual day that we count is held to the same standards. And that's the one thing that we continue to reiterate to the steering committee as they develop this proposed policy, that this is about accountability, it's about equity, it's about those students that are participating or having that virtual learning option, whether it's for one day because there's a gas leak or several days because of a result of a natural disaster or a pandemic or the flu, as Mr. East asked, you still have to have the 330 minutes of instruction throughout that day.
Synchronously and asynchronously.
Synchronously and synchronously
It's
is allowed.
face-to-face, but the computer is a tool for getting to face.
And that all goes back to the state statute, because the state statute says 180 days, 5.5 hours of instruction, it says of actual teaching, in which both teachers and students are engaged. So all of our policies and process standards, and so that's, where we're limited on just developing, like a correspondence course for an older term, just to.
Yeah, in line with Mr. East's comments, I do think that this policy will help establish equitable treatment across schools. I have personally seen I know about, just varying degrees of engagement across schools with the virtual learning. I do have a question about whether there's been any discussion around even providing more guidance around how much of the teaching has to be synchronous or asynchronous.
So that comes into play. That was a discussion. Yes, it was a huge discussion. And that was really discussed more around the next policy under item 2. But as stated, there was some items that were heavily debated. Putting a time frame on 75% of your lesson plan must be synchronous and no more than 25% or 50-50. And the steering committee just didn't reach consensus on that. There was another area, for example, about teachers and whether teachers that are teaching virtually should teach virtually 100% of the time, or whether they could teach half of the day virtual and half the day face-to-face. Because we heard throughout the pandemic from a lot of teachers about the hardship of, preparing lessons to teach both virtually and face-to-face. And that just because I may teach Algebra 1 all day long, that one lesson plan is not sufficient for virtual as well as face-to-face, and they had to make those adjustments, which were quite difficult. So the group didn't reach consensus about that. But when we're ready to walk through policy, 56.2, the district we do allow the district the flexibility within their own local policies, because that's where we get very specific for those that opt to have programs. So again, both of these policies are options for district. If a district makes the decision that they're not going to have any virtual learning days, district-wide, school-wide, or for students that want to participate in a virtual learning program 100% of the time, that's a local district option. But if they choose to have the option of those days under either of these policies, they have to, at a minimum, follow the policy that the board approves, the final policy.
Before we exit this one, Paula, the verbiage on district shall provide sufficient notice, at least one school day for a weather day. What kind of flexibility you gonna have, you know, if proverbial ice storm comes in at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, and they're out? Surely we'll have some kind of flexibility around things like that.
We will, and Mr. East can represent the committee. That was heavily debatable too, but it was all about preparedness, because if districts are not prepared and parents are not notified, then there's not going to be the accountability associated with it. So there will be some flexibility in that. I mean, we're not going to go out and cite a district, but again, it's all about, and then in the next policy, it talks about you're held to the same standards for evaluation. So if we're conducting an audit on site in a district, whether it be unannounced or a full investigative audit, those virtual learning classes are going to be held to that same level. So back to the preparedness piece, and it may not need to be a day, it may need to be a certain time frame. That was debatable, but we're proposing to you what the steering committee reached consensus on as a proposed policy.
So if I can jump in, their concern was, in the example that you gave, is if at 2 o'clock in the morning weather rolls through, if all of the devices that the students use are at the school,
Correct.
then they did not have sufficient notice to ensure that the students and the teachers had their devices at home for that particular day. So in an instance like that, then the recommendation, of course, would be that the district use that as a weather day, because chances are there's no power anyway for the students.
And it was very interesting hearing the conversations between the districts, because we found that what worked well in some districts didn't work
Right.
well at all in others. So there was a lot of conversation about the lessons that were learned and that, but Dr. Malone does make a good point, because they said particularly, for the schools in South Mississippi that have more severe weather as a result of hurricanes, they have days in advance, to plan. And again, if the devices are at school and not at home, then you can't make that conversion too. So it's just kind of following the weather and the prediction of the weather and knowing that it's a possibility, so that the student has the devices.
Well, over the last several years, districts have also implemented late start days too, which also have a requirement for minimum amount of attendance. So this will not impact a late start.
No,
Is that
sir.
correct?
Let me dovetail back in. I am not a primary source for snow days. I got no clue on snow days.
You can tell us about hurricanes, okay?
Talk about wind.
And I think your point's very well taken, Dr. McGehee. I think the deal is in a snow world, do you not know a few days ahead of time that the possibility is there? And those school districts that step up and say, look, we may not, but let's get these things home to children, and they can bring them back when they need to. I think that was kind of came out. and
That was the
a nice
conversation.
The preparedness.
I can prepare for a hurricane, it doesn't mean we don't have lights, or I can prepare for Zeta where we may have lights. So what I'm saying is, it was all about the school district recognizing that you have the chance of something that's going to close your school down and being prepared to go virtual. And that was probably the most fun conversation we had, because that was somebody jumped from the snow world, jumped on me about, y'all may even have electricity. And then we couldn't count those days as well.
Yeah.
Well, it's all about predictability. I mean, being in central portion of the state, it all depends where it crosses that river.
Yep.
How it splits.
Yep. But the point is, if you go ahead and prepare for it, send it home, I think that's what the policy is trying to allow them to do is, Get it home, take care of it, and you don't have to fight that battle, knowing, though, that they've still got the 10 days to play with.
Exactly.
But so if you really believe that education is a 180-day experience, and you're fighting for every day, that keeps them from having to use those 10 days if they can be a little more prepared.
And if I can just add the parent perspective, that one day, like the virtual learning experience is something that families have to plan for as well. And so that is a nice
Think about it.
family-friendly.
We've had across our state, we've had water issues where a particular school may have to close for 2 or 3 days. You can plan for that.
Right.
So what happens at 2 o'clock in the morning, you have a plan for them to come get that computer the next day. It counts as a virtual day if you can begin that process as quickly as possible. One of the things that we need to worry about, and this is like McGee and I were talking about, we just got to communicate these details out.
Yes.
There's really no
Yes.
confusion in the end.
Yeah.
Yes.
And make it, and this is not here's a rule letter, it's very gray in some areas, and you've got to leave that to local schools. We've got to communicate details and be able to answer those questions.
Well, I don't know, I won't say most districts, but I know a lot of districts send out a notice to parents. We're monitoring the weather, you know, we'll make a decision by X time or whatever, depending, I mean, you know, if a tornado blows through, that's one thing, because
Right.
sometimes you can't predict those. But most everything else, the weathermen are real excited about, so you get lots of information. And but you're right, to Dr. Bass's point, parents have to plan too, but there are ways of notifying them to say, there may be a situation, so get prepared.
And much of the conversation that we're having around your questions around policy 9.3 are really more detailed in the next policy and required to be outlined in the local district policy.
Before we exit 9.3 though, I'm going to comment that our legal profession has really driven into our admin about shall. So when they see shall, you know, in this verbiage, they're thinking they have to give that notice the day before. I think we ought to be careful about our verbiage and be a little bit flexible about that.
That's the reason we're going out for APA.
Dr. Vanderford, can I ask a question?
Sure. Come on, Dr. Barrett, go ahead.
As a teacher, I have a concern when we're doing the synchronized, you know, there's been times I'd put Zoom on in my room while I'm teaching. If I have a kid, you know, a student that was out with COVID for 14 days. But I was always concerned about the FERPA, you know, you don't really know who can come on. You know, I'm on Zoom with you now. You don't really know if someone else is coming into the room. Can we do anything about guidelines for that just to keep liability? Is that covered in this?
Let's see, I was thinking it would, well, it would be, it doesn't, we may need to go in and specifically utilize the word FERPA, but in the local district policies, you know, we do refer to FAPE and, you know, codes of conduct and, you know,
That'd be
the
a
use
good
of
edit, though.
devices.
That's a really good
It
edit.
is, I mean,
Yeah.
to,
Because we just embed that along with all the others that
and
we're
and
talking
that,
about.
yeah, and so we,
Dr. Barrett's talking about something we learned the hard way during the past year.
Right,
Yeah.
that's
Of
right.
course, we've also been able to adapt, and you can actually block that out once you get your classroom set up. But I think it is a good idea to get it included in.
so when we walk through policy 56.2, and we talk about the components that, that must be in a local district policy, we'll make sure we add FERPA into that language there.
And I don't really know how it would apply, but it's just been something that's always in the back of my mind. You know, I'm opening this up to my classroom. People can see the other students, and it's just something that we maybe need to look at.
Okay. All right, are we ready to vote? Everyone have their comments and discussion on this? Then, under the Office of Chief Accountability Officer, do we have a motion to approve item 1?
So moved.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. All right, now we'll move to item 2, which is approval of the temporary rule and to begin the APA on state board
56.2.
policy.
And I'll just make a comment, when we include FERPA within policy 56.2, it'll automatically apply to policy 9.3 because policy 9.3 references that in order to do a district-wide, school-wide virtual day, you must comply with 56.2. So if the FERPA language is in 56.2, it's automatically taken care of in 9.3.
great.
So for the sake of time, the first couple paragraphs in policy 56.2 are the same regarding the teaching days, the instruction, the access to all of the teachers. But if you'll look down to the third paragraph in your backup material, that's where it talks about the district options. So districts may opt to have a virtual learning program and for students that would be enrolled 100% of the time. But if they do so, they shall adopt on this one. There must be, there will be a policy that's board approved, a local board approved policy that's published, that's made publicly available. And then we have 9 components, and we'll add the 10th for FERPA, that the policy must include at a minimum. And that's a requirement for parents and students, if age appropriate, to sign a commitment that they acknowledge receipt and acceptance of, and a commitment to the board's local policy for participation in virtual learning. So I think that helps address one of the questions that Dr. Bass had. The criteria for students to participate and remain in virtual learning. So an example here would be if a student begins to fail, then that local policy may require that student no longer be allowed to continue in virtual learning, but must return to face-to-face, as an example. They have to outline their reliable connectivity requirements, the use of student-issued and/or personal devices, attendance requirements, the discipline and code of conduct requirements, equal access, non-discrimination, assurance of a free and appropriate public education for students with disabilities. So they have to conduct meetings pertaining to the evaluation and eligibility, monitoring and documentation of student progress and services, the ongoing communication with the families, the teachers, and the related service providers. And then the criteria for attendance to meet on-campus course requirements, district interim assessments, et cetera. So an example was a speech class. You may have a course that's taught in speech, but the district may have a requirement for that student to come onto campus for one day in order to present, to a class face-to-face. And again, benchmark assessments, but whatever the district would, or the course would deem necessary for a student to be on campus, if it were a field trip, et cetera, that would be required. And then moving on to page 2 of the policy, or page 3 of your backup, all virtual students are required to participate in the required statewide end-of-course assessments. And so it's clear that right now we do not have a remote testing opportunity, so those virtual students would be required to come back on campus. And then there's a paragraph that would prohibit the virtual learning policy or program to circumvent any disciplinary practices, such as suspension and expulsions. And then the next paragraph refers to compliance with all of the state statutes, well, federal and state regulations, the state board policies, et cetera, that are part of the process standards. So if the district were to be audited for any reason, then the lesson plans, student-teacher ratios, everything is applicable. The virtual learning program would be held to the same standards as the face-to-face. And then you have several alsos here. There was a lot of questions about participation in extracurricular activities if you're a virtual learner, and if I'm correct, I think the High School Activities Association has a policy that at this time prohibits students that are 100% virtual learning from participating in any activity that's sanctioned by. And then, again, we reference different policies, but there's been a couple of questions about the current policy that we have for distance and online learning, and I think it's 56.1, where we use the Mississippi Online Course Application Process, or MOCA, and various products from vendors. that districts prior to the pandemic were using to offer Carnegie unit credits or credit recovery, et cetera. So these policies do not impact those policies at all. All of those policies are still in place. I mean, as Dr. McGee mentioned, the extended start date, et cetera, for weather days. So no other policies are impacted by these. We just have to, keep in mind that these policies have to be referenced in conjunction with one another as the districts develop their own local policy.
I have heard from several districts that have unreliable connectivity in their area about the comment on the language about may not utilize asynchronous learning only. Are we prepared to assist any districts with connectivity? Because I know we're not there statewide yet about having to, how are we going to assist those guys?
So there's the technology department here, with the initiatives that they have would be, best suited to answer those questions rather than me. But as we worked through this policy, we did ask the steering committee. We're aware of those concerns and those issues, but we didn't feel like we could allow that to prohibit those that do have the connectivity and the options from utilizing, such a program. But with the district-wide and school-wide, they're going to know what students don't have access. And so those students, there are accommodations under 9.3 for district-wide and school-wide use of virtual days for those students with not connectivity issues. So they wouldn't be excluded. There would be an equal access for them. It would just be through an asynchronous process rather than a combination. But with this to be 100% virtual, we felt like the district should be responsible in their local board policy for establishing their criteria for who is eligible and who has appropriate and meets the appropriate connectivity requirements to present. Because if you, unfortunately, if you don't have connectivity, you can't meet the requirements of this policy, and we can't ensure the level of accountability that's necessary for students that are participating or receiving their instruction virtually to have that same educational experience as those that are face-to-face in the classroom.
So there are a lot of districts, Dr. McGehee, that are using their ESSER dollars, whether it's, particularly 2 or 3, and particularly 3, because 3 is very flexible. We've got districts setting up cell towers around their district in order for kids to get, connected. So this is a very appropriate use for any district that needs more connectivity to take advantage of these federal monies that are here.
Right, but obviously that's a lag time though, and this policy's going in directly start of school, correct?
Well, a lot of districts are already moving in that direction. Because we've had ESSER 1 and 2 for quite a while, and so a lot of districts are already moving in that direction. And I know that the commissioners for broadband have also received additional federal money, and they're already moving in that direction as well, so.
And as a reminder, this policy is not saying that districts have to offer virtual learning.
That's right.
It's
That's right.
only for those districts that are choosing to offer that option. It's not mandating that they offer the option.
And along those lines, this is also saying that student or families get to choose whether they're virtual. Can a district sort of say you have to be virtual based on these requirements?
No, so we're giving the districts, that's part of the requirements that they have, because we've heard of some districts that are having like an application process where they're capping off how many students that they are going to allow to be virtual because of capacity reasons. And so
Right.
they're having they're also, we've heard of some districts that are including what the criteria is to stay. So for example, if a student is failing, then they have to come back and be face-to-face in the building that they're going
Right.
to, so in other words, virtual's not working for them. Some districts are saying, you're signing up and committing to at least staying in there for the whole entire 9 weeks or the whole entire semester. And so this gives the districts that flexibility, but makes them outline what those requirements are in their policies.
But the students have to opt in, right?
Right.
It's not.
Well,
yeah.
the district has to opt in first, because
Right, right.
first of all,
Right.
the requirement is not mandating that every district have
Right.
a virtual learning program for students to enroll in 100%
Right.
of the time. So it's, that's optional, but if they choose to have one, the policy just outlines at a minimum the requirements that must be met, outlined in numbers 1 through 9. And we will amend prior to the APA process to add number 10. Which is the FERPA, to meet the FERPA guidelines. So,
Well, the bottom
upon the
line
board's
is, we would prefer that all students be face-to-face.
Right.
Realizing that there are or may be situations where a student needs to be virtual. But this gives districts the guidelines by which to go
Right.
if somebody chooses to be virtual.
right, and this is
But-
not, oh, I'm sorry.
But I was just going to say, but having heard from our student representatives about mental health and the isolation they felt during the course of this last year, students need to be in school with their teacher and their peers, apparently, from what we've heard. So that would be what we would love to see, is face-to-face. All right, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, all I was gonna say is that we heard from a couple of districts that they're gonna have a policy, but it's not gonna be school-wide, that it would be for students that may be homebound or temporarily homebound, that may be having to travel for treatments or be hospitalized for a certain period of time, that they're still capable of doing their work, but they'll allow those students. So I mean, I think we'll see a lot of variations between what districts choose to do, because again, back to the steering committee, it was, with the principals, particularly with, well, I mean, even the students really were very vocal about, well, this worked in my district, and then another student said, well, that didn't work that way in mine. So, I mean, for every representative that we had, I mean, they had, different varying
Challenges,
success
yeah.
stories and various challenges, et cetera.
Hats off to that committee that put this together. Because, I mean, this has not been an easy process. So really, to all those folks that participated, hats off.
Yeah, the MDE staff that helped facilitate it, and we had some, Patrice Gilforth from the communications team, and again, Cody Shoemaker. I mean, we were all like, how many meetings is it gonna take for us to get through that? I mean, we were trying to establish our timeline, so we said we knew we had to be at the board no later than this June meeting, and so we were just taking a deep breath, hoping that we would have a proposed policy before you today.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments on item 2? All right, I'll entertain a motion then that we approve item 2.
So moved.
Okay, second?
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Item 3, we have several contracts that Dr. Gavin is bringing forward.
Okay, good morning. The first contract that we're bringing forth is a contract with Michael Kent, and it is a new contract, but to continue the work that he's doing with school districts to consolidate and to mentor new superintendents and principals.
Go ahead and make that motion, Mr. McGee, Dr. McGee.
Dr. Gavin, I'd like to ask, have we done a background check on it?
A very thorough one.
So moved. I'll make the motion.
Okay. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay.
We laugh, Madam Chairman, because both of us know him very
Yeah, well, I
well over
know.
our years
He-
of service as superintendent. He's
He
a great guy.
does, yeah, he does a great job for us, and
Yes, he does.
he always gets those hard things.
Yes,
that-
he does.
That aren't pleasant.
With a smile on
usually.
his face. That's right. That's right.
Oh, all right, go ahead, Dr.
Okay,
Gavin.
item 3B is a renewal of a contract with a contract worker that's doing literacy coach work for us.
Okay. Do we want to take all these individually? We want
Oh,
to?
we can walk through.
Yeah, walk through
Okay.
them, and then we'll take B, C, D, and E, unless there are questions about them.
All right, item 3C is awarding competitive contracts for the state food purchasing program, and this is a no-cost contract to the state. The districts have the opportunity to utilize these contracts that we procure on their behalf.
Most of these are just reoccurring
they are.
contracts that we
Yes.
do every year for the districts. Okay, go ahead.
And item 3D is a contract with Service Master to do COVID cleaning in our child nutrition building on Graymont Street.
And then,
And the last contract that we're bringing forth today is a contract with Foreman Watkins to do legal services for us for the Office of Special Education.
any questions on B, C, D, or E? All right, then I'll entertain a motion that we approve items 3B, 3C, 3D, and 3E.
So moved. Second.
Okay? Mr. Miller and Dr. Elam, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay? All right, Dr. Gavin, now you can do the grant awards.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 grants we're bringing to the board for approval today. The first item, item 4A, is to award a 3-year grant to school districts to pilot the dyslexia program.
Let me stop that and ask if we have any questions on that one. Okay, move on.
Okay, item 3B is a grant to award an education in residency to provide literacy support to school districts.
Questions on that one?
Is that
These are-
literacy grant specific, or is it broad-based? In other words, how many districts are involved?
There are 3.
Specific.
Item 4C is a grant to the Mississippi School Board Association, and that's a legislative mandate that we grant that to MSBA, and they provide training to specific school districts.
No question or the comment, that's very powerful professional development for school board members.
All right, we'll take all of these in one motion. Do I have a motion to approve item 4A, 4B, and 4C?
So moved.
Second.
Do we have a second? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Thank you, Dr. Gavin. Item 5 is the consent agenda. We have A through
S.
S. Got a bunch of them. A through S. No one wanted to pull out a specific item, but if you have a question, we'll entertain those before we vote. These are all pretty standard things that we do every year, or some of them every month. So I'll entertain a motion to approve items A through S on the consent agenda.
So moved, Madam Chair.
Okay? Is there a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you. We will now consider an executive session.
Move the board consider making a closed determination of the need to go into executive session.
Okay? Do we have a motion? Do we have a second to Mr. East's motion for executive
Second.
session? All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay? Okay, during our executive session, the board approved several appointments. The first one is Tammy Crosetti, who will serve as Director of Secondary Curriculum and Instruction. Jean Cook will be Director of Communications within the Office of Communication and Government Relations. Corey Jones will work in that same department as Marketing Director. These are two additions there, or not additions, but two people that have been working in that department. They're just moving into a different position. And Dr. Courtney Van Cleve will be the State Director of Educator Talent Acquisition and Effectiveness. This is in the Office of Teaching and Leading. And then Dr. Jeremy Stinson was appointed as the Superintendent of the Mississippi School for the Deaf and Blind. And Dr. Washington Cole will serve as the interim superintendent of the Knoxville County School District. He's been working with that district and with the superintendent that's been there who is departing. So Dr. Cole will take that position for the time being. The board will, as just a matter of information, the board will have a dinner on Wednesday night in Biloxi on July the 14th. This is prior to our July 15th meeting, which will take place in Biloxi at the Performing Arts Center in Biloxi. We will be there for the Mississippi Association of School Superintendents meeting. Some of us will be, and we will have a dinner on Wednesday night. You'll receive more information about that, but just want you to put that on your calendar so that you'll know about that. Anyone need approval for attendance of meetings outside the state? Okay, then if not, we need to vote to approve the location for the board to meet on July the 15th in Biloxi at the Biloxi Performing Arts Center. So I'll entertain a motion that we make that change.
Madam Chair, I move that we have a state school board meeting in Gulfport's biggest rival, Biloxi, Mississippi, on July the 15th, 2021.
I second that.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay. And then, like we've already announced, that meeting will be held in Biloxi at the Performing Arts Center at 10 o'clock, our regular meeting time. So now I will entertain a motion that we adjourn.
So moved.
Okay, is it a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank y'all very much. It was a good
And
meeting.